The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. My name is Lance French. I'm the Business Development Manager for W&M Environmental, a division of Braun Intertech. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on TRI reporting and pollution prevention. Our experts for today are W&M's Lori Siegelman and Victor Kaysen. Thank you for joining us today. You can say hi. Thanks.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. Thanks.
Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, please send them to me through the chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your questions, I will make sure Lori and Victor sees them and we'll get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it will be available to rewatch on our website soon, along with the slides. I will be sending an email with the link when they're made available. So let's get to it. So I wanted to just put a precursor that there is a lot of information on these slides, and so we're not going to be going through line by line, but they'll be available for them to download soon. So let's get introduced our experts. Lori Siegelman is our certified industrial hygienist, a CIH. It's actually, we found out it was actually a CIP on the front, but you all can ignore that. And also a CHMM and a CSP. So she has a lot of acronyms on the end of her name. It's very impressive. So she's our technical director. She has a bachelor's of science in radiological health engineering from A&M. She's an Aggie, which most people at W&M are, but except Victor, you're not.
No.
Yay! Master of Science in Computer Science and Engineering from Louisiana Tech, and a Master's in Public Health and Safety Management from Tulane University, which is in Louisiana.
Yes.
And she's been with W&M for 10 years. Victor is our senior consultant. He has a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Southwestern University and a Master's of Science in Chemistry from Texas Tech University. And he's been with W&M for a year. And you just had an anniversary, like really
This month.
All right. Well, congratulations. So this is our agenda. We're breaking this webinar down into two parts: TRI and pollution prevention, or P2. We're going to do an introduction, go over the highlights, who must report, what chemicals to report, and then how to report. And then on the P2 introduction, who must report, how to determine the progress towards your goals, and then how to report. So, Victor, I'm going to turn it over to you. So, full disclosure.
All right.
You have
Thanks,
the mic.
Lance. As this slide will illustrate to you, we are a Texas-based company, primarily, at least W&M, and as such, most of our slides and information is pretty much representative of what's required in Texas. Now, having said that, the TRI is a federal program, the reporting, and therefore it's applicable to all states. The pollution prevention portion is really slated towards Texas. So if you need additional information, if your state requires it, you need to contact your regulating entity to obtain more information for your state specifically. So moving on into TRI, what is that? Why we have this? TRI was created back in 1986 from the Section 313 of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, which most of us understand as EPCRA. And as such, it was designed to provide information to the public and also to emergency responders should they have to enter a facility in an emergency situation. And as indicated, the deadline is July 1. So, what do you have? What are the requirements that you have to meet to have to report a TRI? You have to have 10 full-time employee equivalents, and notice it says employee equivalents, so it's not just 10 employees. If you have a facility that has fewer than 10, but you have, say, representatives from another location that come on site and work, you have to start counting those hours to be sure that you don't meet that criteria. If you do meet the criteria, that's the first step in saying, okay, I've got one piece down. The next piece is, am I in a covered code, or NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System code? If you're on the list, which includes most manufacturers and so forth, like wholesale electronics, utilities, mining. If you manage hazardous waste, a TSDF, you're also required, you're listed. So that's the first two steps. And the last one is if you manufacture, process, or otherwise use any of the Section 313 chemicals above those threshold limits, which we'll cover later. So what do you mean by manufacture, process, or otherwise use? Well, manufacture, if you produce, prepare, or import a listed chemical, then you have to count that in your threshold determination. And also notice that there's some coincidental production. An example of that might be if you have a wastewater treatment system at your facility, and as part of that, you create or you generate listed chemicals. One example could be nitrates that get created during that chemical process. You have to count the generation and the amount of that nitrate compound or compounds that you generate towards your threshold determination. Okay, so process. A good way to think of process is if you add a listed chemical to your product that you sell in commerce, it becomes processed. You have processed that chemical. So if it's a reactant or it's a listed chemical that's applied to that stays with that product, it's processed. Also note that if you repackage, you buy a product in a certain size or a certain container and you repackage it into different containers, you have processed that. And in addition, off-site recycling is included as processing. Otherwise used. If you don't manufacture or if it doesn't fall into manufacturing or process it, sometimes it can fall into otherwise used. One example would be a solvent that's in a paint or a coating. You apply the coating to your product, the solvent evaporates from the product, so it's not part of the product that goes out into commerce. That's otherwise used. Okay. So are there any exemptions? Yes, there's a bunch. One of them is what they call the de minimis exemption. That being that if you have a concentration, in most cases below 1% of the product, then you do not have to count that chemical towards your threshold. And this can save you a lot of headache, especially when you have a lot of products that have listed chemicals. There are other specific exemptions if it's used as a structural component, routine janitorial or grounds facility. If you have a fleet of motor vehicles that you maintain on site, any of the products that are used to maintain those, antifreeze, brake cleaner, you don't have to include the listed chemicals towards your threshold determination. Okay. There's also an articles exemption. So if you have a product that you purchase and you install that piece into your product that you then sell out into commerce, as long as you don't adjust, alter, manipulate that product, all of the TRI chemicals are contained within that piece, that article, and therefore you don't have to include or count those chemicals towards your threshold determination. And an example that I can come up with is like bearings. So say you buy bearings, you install them into your product, and then sell your product that has the bearing internally. You haven't altered or modified that bearing, and so therefore the TRI chemicals that might be in that bearing would not be included in your threshold determinations or calculations. There's also, if you have like a research and development lab or a QA/QC internal lab, those activities, those are exempt. However, if you were manufacturing chemicals or you had a pilot scale operation or you were conducting activities that might be associated with some analytical work that is not in that lab, that would not be exempt. You'd have to include those. There's also some very specific code exemptions. Just an example, there's coal mining extraction, activities associated with that, any chemicals that are associated with that are exempt. Metal mining overburden is another one that is an NAICS code exemption.
And if I could interrupt, I have an example I think that might illustrate a little bit about this de minimis, the idea of de minimis in the article exemption. So if you're a fabricator and use a lot of metal, because the PBT chemical lead is often incorporated into your carbon steel, for instance, because there's no de minimis for lead, even if there's just a tiny bit in your steel, you can't claim that de minimis. So lead being a reportable chemical, then you have to go through that process of threshold determination. But you could claim this article exemption under certain circumstances. Recently I had a client that eliminated all of their machining activities and started purchasing their pieces and parts basically prefabricated. So they were doing minimal manipulation, but they were doing some drilling of holes and such. So basically we had to go and calculate how much released chemical there was in the process of drilling these holes. Because you can continue to claim the article exemption if you don't have any of your chemical, listed chemical, in this case lead, released in more than half a pound throughout the year. Half a pound you get to pretty quickly. So basically what we had to do is go and calculate how many holes a year are drilled, what's the volume of that hole, and then the quantity or the percentage, 0.01 or whatever it was, percent lead in the steel, and calculate that out to see if we were below the half a pound. And we were able to do that, so that got them out of the tri-reporting that year. So that's got an example that kind of ties together de minimis and article exemption. But if you had wire or tubing that you're stretching, you're drawing it or something and changing its shape, then that article exemption is not applicable in that case.
Or if it's painted? Or is that something different?
It would depend on what's the paint, because the article, let's say it was
sanded,
wire,
polished.
if it was wire that you didn't change and you just painted the wire itself hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. So it would be, does the coating have a TRI chemical in it? So the article exemption for the wire would still be in play.
Gotcha.
Okay. We spoke about already a list of chemicals. Well, there is a long list. It's a little over 700 chemicals and chemical categories, and this is obviously a very small clip from one of those lists. Some of the chemicals that you notice that you will read through, you'll see on the list, have qualifiers like aluminum. It's only counted if it generates or if it's in a form of a fume or a dust. So if you just have a bunch of aluminum stock that you process, you don't include that unless it generates an aluminum fume or dust. It's just that piece of that physical form that you have to count. Also, like for hydrochloric acid, you don't have to include all of the acid. What you have to quantify is how much of an acid aerosol, if you generate or use those or it's formed at your facility, then you have to count that towards that threshold. But that's all you count. There are also chemical categories, as I mentioned. A category would be like compounds, which for metals would be maybe barium. Barium compounds, you have to include all of the barium compounds in your threshold determination. Same is true for copper. Some other chemicals would be glycol ethers. Antifreeze is a pretty common, material or product that's used, but that's just one glycol ether. You may have several in use at your facility. You have to bundle those together to look and see whether or not they meet that threshold criteria. Another one might be nitrate compounds, which are occasionally formed in wastewater treatment processes. And so you have to include generation of all of the different nitrate compounds that might be in use. There's also another example would be of a nitrate compound is in heat treat quench applications. So we've been talking about the chemicals and having to basically calculate and what about a threshold. So what are those thresholds? Well, if you manufacture or process one of the listed chemicals, the threshold is 25,000 pounds. If you otherwise use a chemical, the reporting threshold is 10,000 pounds. And you'll notice it says non-PBT. And Lori mentioned PBT earlier. PBT is a persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemical. And the thresholds for those chemicals are much lower. There's about 20 of these chemicals or categories, and it's reduced typically from 10,000 if it's otherwise used down to 100. And that's regardless if it's manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. It drops to 100 pounds, and in some cases 10 pounds. Examples would be, as Laura mentioned, lead. Lead is a PBT chemical. There's also mercury as another metal. Mercury compounds, dioxin and dioxin-like compounds, which could be generated during combustion activities, depending upon what you're combusting. And the last one that's shown there is polycyclic aromatic compounds. So any and all of these, those PACs that you have in your materials, your products that you use, would have to be counted to see if they exceed those thresholds. So we've talked about counting all these different chemicals, and it can be an extremely onerous task. How do you do this? Some of the easiest ways is to go back and look at different records that you have available, whether they're purchase records. You can check with your accounting department. You might check with your shipping department. How much did you sell of a product so that you can trace what went off-site into commerce? You can look at your safety data sheets for the different products that you use to find out what's in those products. For if you process metals, you might have to look at a mil spec or an ANSI spec for your product to determine what elements are in there and are they on this list. So if you have the concentrations listed on an SDS or a mil spec, then you have to look at, is it an exact concentration? Is it, say, 20%, or does it say it's between 20 and 50%? Normally, if you have a range, then you'd want to report the midpoint of that range. If you have a lower boundary, then what you need to do is go in and look at, okay, well, I say have at least 20% of this listed chemical. What else is in the product that I'm looking at? And you can subtract out the combination of those to figure out what might be the upper boundary. So if it's at least 20%, but we know that there's another 50% of products that are already listed, then, okay, so it's anywhere from 20 to 50. And again, we use a midpoint from there. If it's an upper boundary that says it's no greater than 75%, then that's the number you would use in your calculations. And again, you have to go through all of the products to figure out which products have these listed chemicals. So, as I said, it can be a pretty onerous task. And each threshold is unique. So if you manufacture and you exceed 25,000 pounds, you have to report. If you process and you exceed the threshold, you have to report. If you otherwise use, you have to report. So even if you use less, you process less than 25,000 pounds, but you've otherwise used more than 10,000, you kicked in. You have to report.
So they're basically telling you you're going to report.
If you exceed any of them, you have to report. So Okay, so now we're on to record keeping and documentation. Once you've started your process, you need to document not only the calculations, but what your assumptions are. As we mentioned, if you're using a midpoint and a concentration, document that. If you've looked at purchasing records, keep those records available and with your documentation. You want to have a package basically of information so that when someone asks, how did you come up with these numbers, you have a good method to show the next person, hey, this is how I came up with this information. It's extremely important if you do not have to report, because you then have to show that you've gone through your calculations and I don't meet the reporting threshold. And sometimes that's easy because you're way below. And other times you might be close to a reporting threshold but not exceeding it. Once you've exceeded it, you really can't stop because you do have to count some other things. So you need to collect the data. One of the things that we haven't mentioned is, but in part of your reporting, once you've exceeded that threshold, you have to report releases. What did I release to the air? What did I release to wastewater or stormwater or to the POTW? So that's very critical that you document how you came up with those numbers. Release reporting is probably harder than doing your threshold calculations. And the last piece that's covered there is when you do go through this, you've submitted your report, you need to have all that documentation for 3 years from the time that you submit the report. So July 1, the reports are due. Keep that report on hand and all your supporting documentation for at least the next 3 years. I usually recommend 5, but for at least the next 3 years. How do you do this? Well, since this is a federal program, the EPA has you use their central data exchange system. If you've never logged into CDX, it's not difficult. You log into, you can actually Google or Bing or whatever, the website, EPA CDX. This login will appear in your list of choices. You open the login. If you've never had an account, you just hit register with CDX. It's a very simple process. Once you have created your account, then you go back in and log in. At the bottom left, I believe, there's a selection, a button, Add Program Service. And from that list that pops up, there's a Try Me Web Toxic Release Inventory Made Easy selection. Once you've selected that, you can then enter the Try Me Web software and enter your information. It's fairly easy. There's an online guide, and there are actually internal QA/QC in the process that will help you fill out information. It will tell you something doesn't look right if you have some bizarre entries, and it's not too bad. And certainly you can call and ask Lori or I. We're certainly available to help.
So that was one of the questions I was going to ask. Is that you've been doing this for quite a while. What are some of the pitfalls that people hit? What are some of the triggers that they miss? Because just listening, it's incredibly complicated, and chemicals, and then if you add a chemical, you could be producing another chemical, kind of like
correct
how the Incredible Hulk was created. So I was like,
yeah. Some of the pitfalls are not looking at your generation. What kind of processes do you have that create or potentially create chemicals? Most of the time, I think release reporting is probably the easiest thing to miss. If your facility is required to, say, you have a stormwater pollution prevention plan, and you're required to do sampling, you may have some documentation on what elements you are discharged in your stormwater. That's real easy to overlook. Now, if you're not a covered facility, you've really got no data. You have no data to prove what is being discharged. So in that case, you can say 0 because you really don't know. If you do have a clue and you've got data, then you have to go through the calculations and say, okay, well, based on my stormwater releases and the amount of rainfall that occurred last year, I need to figure that, okay, I released this amount of that element to the stormwater.
Wow. And Lori, you were saying that you actually went through and figured out each drill hole, how much weight or how much dust or waste it was producing, each hole. I mean,
Right. This was in the case where historically a company had been a tri-reporter because of the lead that was in the carbon steel that they used, and they did quite a bit of machining on that steel and fabricating their product. And so therefore they couldn't claim an article exemption on the lead that came in because it wasn't that they were just cutting bar stock. They were actually doing fabrication. So in this case, yeah, this facility, then they kind of changed their whole production where they weren't doing fabrication anymore. They were basically getting pieces and parts in, prefabricated, and then just assembling. In the process of doing that, they did have to still drill holes, basically.
so I mean, so this was something that they didn't think about. You went through and like, hey, are we
Right.
figuring out that?
Had they just been, marching on, yes, we've always reported, we're not gonna continue going through the determination process because we know we already did that piece of it, so we're just going to report every year. They would have just continued on. But knowing that facility, that they changed their process pretty significantly, and maybe they could claim this article exemption now on their incoming, on the steel that they've processed. We were able to do that and get them out of tri-reporting altogether.
Well, I have a question from the audience.
Sure.
So if you guys have any questions, now would be a great time to add them in. But I have 2 questions actually. What if I figured out that I should have been What if I figure out that I should have been reporting? Should I go back and report for previous years or just start now?
Well, there's a self-reporting capability within the TryMe software. So you can self-disclose that you've discovered this, and it's recommended that you go back and go ahead and report for prior years. That way you'd have the documentation on file. You could show that whether maybe in prior years, maybe it's only 1 or 2 years back, it would be a good thing to go ahead and do that to complete your prior reporting.
Yeah, most of the people that are our clients that we have helped with this go back, and if they figured they need to report, they go back as many as 5 years, because really EPA can come and fine you or at least ask for records back 5 years, even though the record keeping requirement is 3. And then it's within CDX, the CDX software. They've moved that self-disclosure ability that gets you, that buys you some relief from potential fines and violations, so that you can kind of self-report within the CDX program. And then go back and redo or submit, not redo, but submit for previous 5 years, and that gets you.
So going back to your hole drilling example, if EPA would have come through and found that, would that have been a big fine, or how would they have handled that, or say, oh, messed up, or I'm sure it wasn't.
Well, I'm not sure what that question is, but if they just stop reporting, and they've reported historically, and then now all of a sudden they're not, there is a feature, I think, or a question somewhere within your TryMe software, when you're submitting a report, if you have a pollution prevention project or some change in production that you've expected, then you can enter in this year's tri-report that you expect not to report next year because of what, this, that, or the other. Or if now it's reporting season, you don't have to report for last year, you can go ahead and submit no report, or shoot even just an email to the regional tri person here at EPA that says, hey, you might be looking for a report from me, but we've implemented some P2 program, or whatever the case is, and so we're not going to report. That way they're not just flagging, because they do go and flag historical reporters that all of a sudden they're not reporting, they'll flag those and they'll follow up and ask that question.
Okay. The other question is manganese in welding wire. Is that used in? Oh, wait, sorry. Let me back that up. Manganese in welding wire that is used in steel fabrication. Is it processed or is it otherwise used? Did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure.
That's the answer, yes. No. It depends on what happens with in the welding process. So if the manganese is actually incorporated into your product that you sell, that by incorporation into the product, it's processed, that piece of it. Now, there may be also a piece or a part of the manganese that was in the welding rod that's that vaporizes, becomes a fume, and that would be otherwise used. So you might have both. Now, you can use, again, that's two different threshold calculations. If it's incorporated into your product, it's processed. If it's vaporized and lost or released, it becomes otherwise used. So one's 10,000 and one's 25,000. And my guess is if it actually adds to your product, you're going to have a whole lot more that's processed than otherwise used.
Yep. And
Don't look at me.
Clear as mud, right?
Don't look at me.
Clear as mud.
And I've gone down that road for some of our clients that do a lot of welding. You do have to keep in mind that the thresholds we're talking here are 10,000 and 25,000 pounds. So if you're welding or you're fabricating or you're doing whatever you're doing, but you only, use a few buckets of paint a year or a few packages of welding rods, you can kind of figure that this whole thing doesn't apply to you and just go on.
Yeah.
But in relation to the welding rods and manganese and things like that, there are specifications and calculation spreadsheets available from industry organizations and manufacturers of welding wire, welding rods that have this data available. So how much manganese typically is emitted into the air as in the fume of welding when you're doing this type of welding using this product. They have that data available, which is helpful in figuring out, one, in the threshold determination, and then two, if you do have to report, how much is released to the air. So that information is available. You just have to know where to look for it.
Okay, well, great job, Victor. Thank you. We're gonna go over to the pollution prevention. So, Lori, Victor's got our audience all revved up and excited. So this is going to be easy for you. This is just walk in the park.
Good.
So
Excellent.
So go ahead.
Yep. The second part of our program or webinar today, pollution prevention reporting, and basically I think we've incorporated these two together because the deadline for both of these reports is July 1st. In addition, the pollution prevention planning rules, one of the triggers for being covered under that in Texas is if you're a TRI reporter. So I want to start by just explaining the Waste Reduction Policy Act, 1991, adopted by the Texas legislature in an effort to reduce the volume, toxicity, and adverse effects related to pollutants in Texas. So there, if you wanted to go, a little reading material tonight, 30 Texas Administrative Code 335.471 through 480.
Amen.
So as Victor mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we are mainly a Texas-based consulting company, and so many of our clients are in Texas, and we do a lot of pollution prevention or P2 work for our clients. This is a Texas-specific rule. So any of our participants today that are outside of Texas, this is not really relevant to you because obviously it's Texas-based, and if you're not in Texas, you don't have to do this particular type of reporting. But if you are in Texas, there are many types of facilities that would be required to report under this act, the Waste Reduction Policy Act. Auto repair facilities, manufacturing facilities, if you machine parts, chemical plants. So a lot of different types of facilities. If you generate enough waste to report on an annual waste summary, or if you manufacture, process, or otherwise use enough toxic chemicals to report on a TRI Form R, then this applies to you. You're a large quantity generator, a small quantity generator of hazardous waste, and facilities that report on the Form R are all covered facilities. So if you are covered under this, what are the requirements? Then under this law, you have to prepare a pollution prevention plan. Now that plan isn't necessarily submitted to the state. You keep a copy of the plan on site for inspection. So if you ever were inspected, they would expect to see a copy of a P2 plan. You are required to submit the executive summary of the plan along with a signed certificate of completeness and correctness. And then if you're a large quantity generator or a Form R tri-reporter, then you also have to submit a progress report, annual progress report. That's what's due on July 1st. So is an annual progress report. If you're already covered under the plan, your annual progress report is due on the same day your tri-report is due, assuming you're a tri-reporter. But the purpose of the annual report for the state of Texas is you want to track your progress toward your goals, so that would be your purpose, but also quantify the success of the projects. And Texas also uses that data. They use it to prepare reports for legislature and their success in reducing pollutants in Texas. So those are the requirements, the main requirements of the rule or the policy. So now that you're familiar with the requirements, so who's covered, who has to report, who has to prepare a plan and then report on their progress. The overall pollution prevention planning process, there's many ways to approach this. The TCEQ offers workshops every year that can benefit all types of levels of experience. So a lot of people I see, they see the workshop and they say, I'm already, I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't really need to go to the workshop. But their speakers and their people that are there are very knowledgeable on more recent trends and benefits. So all levels of experience can benefit from their workshops they put on, and they're very cost effective, offered throughout the state of Texas. I think it's in the spring or the fall, I can't remember. But they're advertised on their website if you wanted to go check that out. But another P2 planning process, if you have any type of environmental management system in place where you're looking for ways to, or your environmental aspects and impacts, and how do you reduce your impact or your environmental footprint, that can be your method of planning your progress. But basically you want to identify your pollutants and your activities that generate pollutants, whether those pollutants are tri-chemical releases or hazardous waste releases. Identify and evaluate potential pollution prevention projects. Then you prioritize those projects based on how feasible is it to implement, how much bang for your buck are you going to get, low-hanging fruit first, right? And then set your goals, train your employees, and there you go. And the next slide really is a slide or a diagram I stole from the TCEQ regulatory guide. There's a regulatory guide that's been updated pretty recently about the whole pollution prevention plan, the planning process, the Reduction Policy Act itself, and all of the different, from A to Z. How do you do a plan? How do you report? How do you develop projects? How do you fill out your forms? All of it. So it's very, very helpful. If you are unfamiliar with this process and need some help, you might consider that. But this is the process. This is just one example of how you might identify what your pollutants are, which is the first step. You have to know what your pollutants are before you can figure out what you're going to reduce. So now you want to go and develop your pollution prevention plan, right? What has to be in the plan? So if you look at the rule in the Act, there's specific things that have to be included in a pollution prevention plan. So the list on this screen is all the required elements that must be present in your plan if you're a large quantity generator or a tri-reporter. And once you have your plan, too, it's a 5-year plan. So you look out for the next 5 years, you develop your plan, you submit the executive summary of that plan to the TCEQ. But if you're really using the plan and you're doing pollution prevention, then you look at that plan throughout your whole 5 years. You might update it as you go along based on your experience. Anyway, so these are the required elements for large quantity generators and tri-reporters. If you're a small quantity generator, the list is a little less. It's a little less onerous. The things that have to be in the plan, but no specific format is required, I might add. Even the format for the executive summary isn't set as long as the required elements are there. However, the TCEQ does have a specific form, basically, that you can fill out that satisfies the requirements of an executive summary. And then it comes along with your certification statement and your signature page that you have to submit to them. The due dates for the plan, this causes a lot of confusion. And a lot of people don't realize, they don't even know of the existence of this whole requirement. But they've been a tri-reporter for 5 years, so now what's our due date? But let's say that you just now become a tri-reporter. So like last year in 2018, you've processed more than you used to in the past, and now you're a tri-reporter. What is your due date? The first tri-report is submitted July 1st, so you've got 90 days in order to submit your P2 executive summary. Develop the plan and submit your summary. So this is just a list of the due dates. When is your initial 5-year plan and executive summary due? Well, it's due within 90 days, whichever comes first, either your first annual waste summary, if you've now become a small quantity or large quantity generator, or a tri-reporter. And then I have an example, for example, in that last box there, if you're still confused. And then every 5 years, January 1st of the 6th year, then you have to submit a new executive summary. Now, how do you measure your progress, right? You have to have a base year that you're going to look at to determine, have you met your goal? How are you doing compared to your goal? The year prior to the first year of your plan should be your base year. So, for instance, if your 5-year P2 plan covers 2019 through 2023, your base year would be 2018. But let's say you're a tri-reporter, your tri-report isn't due until July 1st, and you just now realize you should have had a P2 plan all these years and you haven't, and you're just now doing your plan, and your base year date of 2018 hasn't been calculated yet. You don't know what your releases are because you haven't done your calculations yet because it's not July 1st yet. But you want to go ahead and do your plan, right, because it was due like 3 years ago. You can use the year prior. So if I'm doing P2 plan now for a client maybe that missed the original due date and I need to come up with base year data, even though their plan is going to be 2019 through 2023, their base year data is going to be 2017. So that's how you come up with your base year. You get that data. That's included on your executive summary. So every year you go to do your annual progress report, that base year data is going to be there and what you measure yourself against. How much have you improved? So facilities that are large quantity generators or tri-form R reporters have to report annually. So if you're small quantity, you can disregard the annual progress report. But it's due July 1st every year. If you have 10 or more employees, and this is a change this year, I believe, if you have 10 or more employees, then you are required to submit your annual progress report using the electronic reporting system in Texas. Prior years, I believe you could have submitted a paper report. But beginning this year, 10 or more employees, and that's pretty much everybody, right? That's going to be a large quantity generator. In falling into this program, pretty much going to have more than 10 employees unless you're just really, really good and a large amount of production with a few employees. Anyway, moving on. You have to use STEERS for that and the annual progress report. So how do you come up with your annual progress report? The most important information collected is the amount of pollution reduced at the source. I think I touched on this at the beginning of this part of the presentation, but the purpose of the progress report is to assist you in monitoring your progress toward your goal. And then the TCEQ analyzes this data. They report statewide status of their P2 program in Texas to the legislature. They also like to communicate pollution prevention progress to the press and to the public. And this is a good opportunity for facilities to get some good public relation going. If you've got a good P2 program and you've really made some strides and you have something you can kind of wave in the air to your community and get awards even from TCEQ of good work, and it could be important, especially if you've got some permitting things going on maybe and you need to have good communication with your public in your community so you don't get bad PR during your permit review process. So that would be one good thing you could use your annual report for. So when we get more involved or more into the details of annual reporting, there's a couple of different terms now that come into play. You've got source reduction projects and then you've got waste minimization projects. And the difference is going to be important because the annual progress report wants you to report your progress towards source reduction, not necessarily waste minimization. Both are good, both are important, but in the pyramid or the hierarchy of pollution prevention, source reduction is what really you want to strive for. It occurs before waste is generated and could be something like equipment or technology modification, procedure changes, raw material substitution, whereas waste minimization occurs after the waste has already been generated. And this is your reusing, your recycling, reuse, recycle. You neutralize it so you make it less hazardous, but you've already generated it. The waste has been generated. So waste minimization is good, but not as good as source reduction. And the source reduction P2 projects are what the annual progress report wants to hear about. So part one, we'll get into more of the details of your annual progress report, what goes into it. And I have just a clip of, or a screenshot of the paper version of the progress report, which looks a lot different than what you'll see within STEERS, because STEERS will pre-populate this for you based on the information submitted in your executive summary. But if you're filling it out from scratch or on the hard copy, paper copy, you want to just put regular facility description in your part one, and then part two, this is how much waste you expect to reduce by the end of the 5th year of your plan, projected amounts. And again, these projected amounts will automatically show up on your report in your STEERS program if you're using that based on what you submitted in your executive summary. It'll have your 5th year already filled in for you, and it should already fill in the estimated quantities on your 5th year. But just as an example here, if your goal year is the 5th year of the plan, if your plan begins in 2016, your goal year would be 2020, then this section here is going to be your measurable reduction goal. The row 1 would enter, say row 1, they have 2 different columns. One's hazardous waste and one's tri-chemicals. So if you're only a hazardous waste generator and you're not a tri-reporter, your column B is going to be totally blank. And then vice versa. If you're only a tri-reporter but don't have hazardous waste, then your column A would be blank. But anyway, your goal year projected amounts will already be filled in. Then you just have to figure out what your reduction achievements were for the report year. So this year you're going to look at, this is 2019, your report year is calendar year 2018. Then you have to look at your pollution prevention projects. So say you have something where you're have a preventive maintenance program for all of your flanges and your pumps and this and that, because you want to reduce your spills so you don't have as much hazardous waste, solvent waste going out, because maybe one of your reportable chemicals is toluene, and you transload toluene, for instance, or some chemical that has toluene in it. Good operating practices, you have a pollution prevention goal or activity project that relates to good housekeeping, and you've managed to reduce your spills by 50%, whatever, so you calculated that into how many pounds or tons of toluene that you saved in 2018 compared to your base year. And that's how you go about this. You try to fit your pollution prevention project into one of these types of reduction, cleaning, degreasing, surface prep and finishing, product modification. Try and fit it into one of those things, and then you report that in one of those columns, whether it's a tri-release reduction or a hazardous waste reduction. And then you would just submit the report. So a big question usually comes up is, if you have you produce twice as much in 2018 of your product as you did in 2017, so you have twice as much waste, for instance. Well, you need to use a modifier for that. So you can basically divide everything by half if you have twice as much production. So you would normalize that. Normalize your waste or your tri-releases based on your production. So you can do that, so you can show progress even if your annual waste summary shows more hazardous waste going out than the year before. If you had more production that would justify that, then you need to, account for that and say, well, we really did have a reduction by applying the normalization factor.
I do have a question, if you have a second. What if I am a tri-reporter and can't reduce anything?
We have a lot of clients, actually, that we help with their P2 planning and executive summary and annual reporting that fall into this category because they're a tri-reporter, and they don't have any hazardous waste. They're conditionally exempt, and they're, by virtue of just their process, because they manufacture lead, for instance, and they trigger that 100-pound threshold of processing a tri-reportable chemical, and they have to report. But they don't have any waste. Their releases are associated with their air emissions, for instance, that are tiny, and unless they just stop manufacturing that product altogether, there's no waste for them to reduce. In that case, then there are a couple different options. The first option is there is an exemption that you could get from P2 planning, but it's annual. You can't just ask for the exemption once and it be done. So there's work that you have to do. Every year you have to submit a letter or a form or request that exemption. It takes a while, and it's an onerous process compared to the work it would take just to submit your annual progress report on steers. That's just a couple of entries that says we had zero progress because there's no feasible or economical projects that we can implement, and you're done. Obviously you want all that to be accurate. You're not just saying zero to be done and get away with it. But if you really don't have any projects, and you're just kind of caught up in this regulation by virtue of being a tri-reporter, there's nothing you can do. Either ask for the exemption every year, go through that process, or go ahead and just report zero progress.
Okay. One more question. It could be the same answer, but I'm going to read the question anyway. What if in your efforts to reduce the source reduction that identify that certain process cannot be done? What happens if this cannot be achieved?
Well, in that case, then I think you would want to revisit your pollution prevention plan in your projects and maybe pick another one and update your plan accordingly. Make the documentation that, we tried to implement this, and the implementation failed or wasn't feasible for whatever reason, and you document that, then you can do one of two things. You can either continue to report on that project on your annual progress report of 0 progress, or you could go ahead and submit a new executive summary, perhaps, and start reporting on a different project, maybe.
Okay. Well, Lori, I know these are your favorite. Webinars are your favorite. And with that, you guys are done. Thank you guys so much for all your work and your time to put this together. There's Lori's and Victor's contact information. So if you do have any other questions or want to reach out and talk to them about a specific project, there's their contact information. And they would be very happy to answer your questions. And then our next webinar is 4 short weeks from today, April 25th, on Lockout Tagout, because April is Safety Awareness Month, National Safety Month or something like that, National Safety Month. Safety is always a very important part of W&M and Bronze, which should be yours. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining us. I just want to repeat that we are recording this webinar, and it'll be posted probably tomorrow if I can get it done this afternoon. It will be, and the slides with all that great information will be up as well. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you next time.